On August 1st, 1944, at precisely 5 p.m., the Polish Home Army launched an uprising in Warsaw that was planned to last 3 days. 63 days later, on October 2nd, the last Polish fighters surrendered. In those 9 weeks, 200,000 Polish civilians were killed. The city of Warsaw was systematically destroyed, reduced to rubble by German demolition teams. And when it was over, Poland's strategic situation had not improved. The Soviet army, which had been approaching Warsaw when the uprising began, waited on the eastern bank of the Vistula River while Germans crushed the rebellion. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they occupied ruins and established a communist government. This is the story of the Warsaw Uprising. 63 days of desperate fighting that accomplished nothing strategically, cost everything humanly, and demonstrated the cruel calculus of great power politics, where Polish lives were currency spending games the Poles did not control. It is a story of extraordinary courage wasted through tragic timing, of strategic miscalculation compounded by political betrayal, and of a city that chose to fight for freedom and paid with its complete destruction. The Warsaw Uprising cannot be understood without understanding Poland's situation in 1944. For 5 years, Poland had been under brutal German occupation. The country had been invaded from the west by Germany and from the east by the Soviet Union in September 1939, then partitioned between the two totalitarian powers. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Poland came entirely under German control, subjected to a regime of systematic exploitation, cultural destruction, and mass murder. The Polish government in exile, based in London, maintained a military organization inside occupied Poland called the Home Army, or Armia Krajowa. The Home Army was the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe, numbering perhaps 400,000 members by 1944. It conducted intelligence operations, sabotage, and maintained an underground state complete with courts, schools, and administration. The Home Army's ultimate purpose was to rise against the German occupation when the moment was strategically favorable, liberate Poland, and ensure that the legitimate London-based government controlled the country when Allied forces arrived. By summer 1944, that moment appeared to have arrived. Soviet forces, having driven the Germans back across Eastern Europe in series of massive offensives, were approaching Poland from the east. By late July, Soviet forces had reached the Vistula River, across Warsaw. The sound of Soviet artillery could be heard in the city. German forces in Warsaw appeared to be preparing to evacuate. The strategic calculation seemed clear. If the Home Army rose now, liberated Warsaw before Soviet forces arrived, the London government could claim legitimacy as the authority that had freed the capital. But this calculation contained a fatal flaw. The Soviet Union had no intention of allowing a Polish government aligned with the West to control Poland. Stalin had already established a rival communist-controlled Polish Committee of National Liberation in Lublin. When the Soviet forces entered Polish territory, they arrested Home Army members, disbanded units, and installed communist administrators. The pattern was clear to everyone willing to see it. The Soviets intended to impose a communist government on Poland, and the existence of a powerful Western-aligned home army threatened its objective. The decision to launch the Warsaw Uprising was made in this context of approaching Soviet forces, apparent German withdrawal, and the political imperative to establish facts on the ground before the Soviets arrived. General Tadeusz Bor Komorowski, commanding the Home Army, ordered the uprising to begin on August 1st. The plan called for seizing key objectives in Warsaw, holding them for approximately 3 days until Soviet forces arrived, then turning control over to the London government's representatives. The assumption that the uprising would last 3 days was based on the expectation of rapid Soviet advance. Soviet forces were approximately 6 miles from the city center. Soviet radio broadcasts encouraged the Polish population to rise against the Germans. The logical conclusion seemed to be that Soviet forces would enter Warsaw within days, linking up with the insurgents and completing liberation. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Home Army forces that rose on August 1st numbered approximately 40,000 fighters, though only about 2,500 had firearms at the start of the uprising. The remainder were armed with makeshift weapons, Molotov cocktails, or nothing at all, expecting to capture German weapons during the fighting. The fighters were organized into districts, each district responsible for objectives in its area. The plan called for simultaneous attacks across the city at 5 p.m., the moment chosen because German forces would be changing shifts, theoretically vulnerable to surprise. The initial attacks achieved mixed success. In some districts, Polish forces seized their objectives quickly. In others, Germans' resistance was stronger than anticipated. The critical objectives, the bridges across the Vistula, the airport, and the central rail station, were not captured. German forces, while surprised, responded quickly. Within hours, German reinforcements were moving into the city, establishing strong points and beginning counterattacks. The German response to the Warsaw Uprising was directed by SS Obergruppenführer Erich von den Bach-Zelewski, appointed by Heinrich Himmler to suppress the rebellion. Bach-Zelewski had extensive experience in anti-partisan operations on the Eastern Front, experience that translated into systematic brutality. His forces included SS police units, Wehrmacht security divisions, and the Dirlewanger and Kaminsky brigades, units composed of criminals and Soviet collaborators notorious for atrocities. The initial German response was characterized by mass reprisals against civilians. In the Wola district, German forces systematically executed civilians in a 3-day rampage that killed approximately 40,000 people. The murders were conducted block by block, house by house. Civilians were dragged into streets and shot. Buildings were set on fire with residents still inside. The objective was to terrorize the population into submission and to drain Home Army morale by killing the people they were supposed to protect. The Wola Massacre established the pattern for German operations in Warsaw. The uprising would not be treated as military operation governed by laws of war. It would be treated as a security threat requiring elimination of the entire population. Civilians and combatants would be killed indiscriminately. The city itself would be destroyed. Himmler's orders were explicit. Warsaw was to be leveled, its population eliminated or expelled, the city razed so thoroughly that it could never serve as a center of Polish resistance again. Against this genocidal campaign, the Home Army fought with extraordinary courage and desperation. Without heavy weapons, adequate ammunition, or external support, they defended their districts street by street, building by building. They constructed barricades from rubble, paving stones, and furniture. They dug tunnels through basements to move between buildings without exposing themselves to German fire. They crafted improvised explosives from captured materials, and they fought, often hand to hand, for every meter of ground. The fighting in Warsaw was urban combat of the most intimate and brutal kind. Ranges were measured in meters. Germans and Poles fought from opposite ends of the same street, sometimes the same building. Snipers engaged targets across rooms. Grenades were thrown through windows. Buildings changed hands multiple times. The defenders withdrawing to upper floors, then basement, fighting until overrun or until collapse. The civilian population, trapped in the city, suffered catastrophically. German artillery and aircraft bombed residential areas indiscriminately. The Luftwaffe employed Stuka dive bombers, including the infamous Jericho trumpets, to terrorize the population. Food supplies dwindled, water supply systems were destroyed, medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded. Thousands sheltered in basements, cellars, and sewers, living in conditions that combine medieval squalor with modern industrial violence. Throughout August, the Home Army sent desperate messages to London requesting Allied support. The requests were specific: weapons and ammunition, drops, bombing of German positions, and most critically, Soviet intervention. The responses from London were supportive, but largely ineffective. The British and Americans were willing to help, but faced severe logistical constraints. Warsaw was at the extreme range of Allied aircraft based in Italy. Supply missions requiring flying 1,700 miles round trip, most of it over German-occupied territory, to drop supplies into a city actively contested. The missions were extraordinarily dangerous, and the tonnage that could be delivered was minimal. Nevertheless, Allied crews flew the missions, suffering heavy casualties to deliver weapons and supplies that often fell into German hands or missed the drop zones entirely. The critical factor, however, was not Allied support but Soviet action. Soviet forces remained stationary on the Vistula eastern bank, within artillery range of Warsaw, and did not intervene. Stalin's position was communicated through various channels. The Warsaw Uprising was an adventure by elements not coordinating with Soviet command. The insurgents were criminals and adventurers, and Soviet forces would not come to their aid. The reasons for Soviet inaction had been debated by historians. The Soviet official position was that Soviet forces were exhausted from their summer offensive, facing stiffening German resistance, and unable to advance further. This explanation had elements of truth. Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of miles, outrunning their logistics, and German forces had indeed counterattacked, stabilizing the front line east of Warsaw. But the strategic calculation was also clear. A successful home army uprising, liberating Warsaw independently, would establish the London government's claim to legitimacy. This was unacceptable to Stalin, who intended to install a communist government in Poland. The destruction of the Home Army, Poland's largest anti-communist military force, served Soviet interests. Therefore, Soviet forces waited while the Germans and the Home Army destroyed each other. Soviet forces not only refused to advance, but also denied Allied aircraft permission to land on Soviet-controlled airfields after dropping supplies in Warsaw. This denial forced Allied crews to fly the full 1,700-mile round trip without stopping to refuel, drastically reducing the tonnage that could be delivered. When Allied commanders requested Soviet air support for Warsaw, the requests were refused. When Western leaders pressed Stalin to assist the uprising, he equivocated, delayed, and ultimately did not do anything until the uprising was already failing. By early September, the Home Army situation was desperate. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Casualties exceeded 50% in some units. The civilian death toll was approaching 100,000. German forces, having suppressed the uprising in outlying districts, were concentrating in the old town and city center, where the largest Polish forces remained. The Battle of the Old Town, fought from August through early September, was among the most intense German combat of World War II. The medieval district, with its narrow streets and multi-story buildings, favored defenders. But German forces brought up heavy weapons including Goliath remote-controlled explosive vehicles, Carl Garrett super heavy mortars firing 2-ton shells, and flame-throwing tanks. Against these weapons, courage and determination were insufficient. On September 2nd, the Home Army commander on the Old Town, recognizing the position was no longer tenable, ordered evacuation through the sewers. Thousands of fighters and civilians made their way to Warsaw's sewer system, wading through waste in darkness, navigating by compass and memory to emerge in the city center district. The evacuation, conducted under fire and in conditions of unimaginable squalor, succeeded in saving thousands who would otherwise have been killed or captured. The loss of the Old Town marked the beginning of the end. Through September, German forces systematically reduced remaining Polish-held areas. The pattern was consistent: heavy bombardment, infantry assault supported by armor, and when resistance proved stubborn, the deployment of specialized weapons, including flamethrowers and demolition charges, to destroy buildings with defenders inside. The Home Army, now compressed into a few districts, continued fighting, but with diminished hope. The fighters knew the uprising had failed strategically. The Soviets were not coming. The Germans would not be defeated by lightly armed insurgents. Surrender was inevitable. The only questions were when and under what terms. General Bor Komorowski, facing the choice between continued resistance that would result in complete destruction of the remaining population or negotiated surrender, chose surrender. On October 1st, Negotiations began with German forces. The terms were surprisingly lenient, considering the brutality that had characterized the fighting. Home army fighters would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, not as partisans subject to summary execution. Civilians would be evacuated from the city. The agreement was signed on October 2nd, 1944. The surrender marked the end of the fighting, but not the end of Warsaw's agony. German forces, having accepted surrender, began systematic demolition of the city. Special units, equipped with explosives and flamethrowers, moved through Warsaw block by block, destroying buildings, monuments, and infrastructure. The objective was to erase Warsaw from existence, to ensure that it could never again serve as Poland's capital. The demolition continued through October, November, and December. When it concluded, approximately 85% of Warsaw's buildings were destroyed. The old town, the medieval heart of the city, was completely leveled. The city center was reduced to rubble, monuments were dynamited, libraries were burned, museums were looted and then destroyed. The Germans executed their mission with industrial efficiency, transforming a city of 1.3 million into a wasteland. The casualty figures from the Warsaw Uprising were staggering. Approximately 16,000 to 18,000 Home Army fighters were killed. Another 25,000 were wounded. German casualties were estimated at 10,000 killed and 9,000 wounded, though these figures are disputed. But the overwhelming majority of casualties were civilians, between 150,000 and 200,000 Warsaw civilians were killed during the uprising, in massacres, during bombardments, or in the reprisals that followed surrender. The survivors, approximately 800,000 civilians, were expelled from the city. They were processed through transit camps, many sent to Germany for forced labor, others to concentration camps. The population of Warsaw was dispersed across Europe, the city depopulated, its cultural and intellectual class decimated. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found ruins and perhaps a few thousand people who had hidden during the explosions. The question that has haunted Polish history since 1944 is whether the Warsaw Uprising should have been launched. The arguments for uprising emphasize Polish honor, the imperative to resist occupation, and the political necessity of demonstrating Polish agency. The arguments against emphasized the military impossibility of success without external support and the predictable catastrophic cost to the civilian population. With historical hindsight, the decision to launch the uprising appears tragically mistaken. The strategic assumptions underlying the decision that Soviet forces would advance into Warsaw within days, that the Germans were preparing to evacuate, that the uprising could establish facts favoring the London government, all proved wrong. Soviet forces did not advance. Germans did not evacuate, but instead reinforced. And the establishment of facts on the ground resulted not in the London government legitimacy, but in complete destruction. The political calculation was equally flawed. The belief that a successful uprising would influence Stalin's decisions about Poland's post-war government underestimated both Stalin's ruthlessness and Soviet power. Stalin had already decided Poland would have a communist government aligned with Moscow. The existence or non existence of a home army uprising was irrelevant to that decision. By launching the uprising, the home army effectively destroyed itself, removing the only significant military force that might have resisted Soviet imposed communist rule. Yet, the counter argument deserves consideration. The Poles understood, or should have understood, Soviet intentions. They recognized the Soviet occupation would mean communist dictatorship. Faced with the choice between German occupation, ending in Soviet occupation, or attempting to fight for independence, knowing the attempt would likely fail, they chose to fight. The uprising, in this interpretation, was not a strategic miscalculation, but a moral choice, a decision that freedom was worth fighting for even if the fight was doomed. This interpretation transforms the Warsaw Uprising from a military disaster into a moral statement, a declaration that some things are worth dying for even when victory is impossible. By this measure, the uprising succeeded not in its strategic objectives, but in its demonstration of Polish unwillingness to accept subjugation passively. The costs were terrible, but the alternative, passive acceptance of Soviet occupation, was morally unacceptable. The international response to the Warsaw Uprising was characterized by sympathy, limited action, and ultimately abandonment. Churchill and Roosevelt both pressed Stalin to assist the uprising, but their leverage was limited. The Western Allies needed Soviet cooperation for the defeat of Germany and the planned invasion of Japan. Threatening that cooperation over Poland was considered but rejected as strategically unaffordable. The Allied supplied mission flown from Italy, while brave, were insufficient. Approximately 200 flights attempted supply drops. About 40% successfully delivered cargo into Polish hands. The tonnage delivered, perhaps 100 tons of weapons and supplies total, was a fraction of what was needed. The missions cost Allied crews heavily, with approximately 30 aircraft lost, but they could not materially affect the uprising's outcome. The Soviet contribution was cynical in the extreme. After refusing assistance throughout August and September, Soviet forces made a token effort in mid-September, allowing a single Polish unit fighting under Soviet command to cross the Vistula and attempt to link up with the insurgents. The attempt failed with heavy casualties, and Soviet forces made no further efforts. The gesture appeared designed to deflect criticism while changing nothing substantively. The post-war consequences of the Warsaw Uprising shaped Poland's history for decades. The destruction of the home army removed the primary military force that might have resisted communist takeover. When Soviet forces imposed the communist government in 1945, there was no organized military opposition. Individual resistance continued for years, with anti-communist partisans operating in forests into the early 1950s. But they lacked the coordination and strength the home army had possessed. The destruction of Warsaw itself had profound psychological and cultural impact. The city that had been Poland's capital, its cultural and intellectual center, was erased. Reconstruction began after the war, with the old town rebuilt from historical records and photographs. But the reconstruction was symbolic. The Warsaw that existed before 1944 was gone, its population scattered or dead, its buildings rubble, its cultural continuity severed. The memory of the Warsaw Uprising in communist Poland was complicated. The communist government, installed by the Soviets, could not celebrate an uprising conducted by forces loyal to the London government and implicitly anti-Soviet. But neither could they completely suppress memory of an event where hundreds of thousands of Poles died fighting Germans. The solution was selective commemoration, emphasizing the anti-German resistance while minimizing the anti-Soviet political context. After the fall of communism in 1989, the Warsaw Uprising was re-evaluated. Museums were established, survivors shared testimonies. The political context, particularly Soviet betrayal, was openly discussed. The uprising became a symbol of Polish resistance to both Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism. A demonstration that Poles would fight for freedom even against impossible odds. The survivors of the Warsaw Uprising, those who lived in the 21st century, carried trauma that never fully healed. They have fought for weeks in conditions of unimaginable horror. They had watched civilians massacred, friends killed, their city destroyed. They had surrendered knowing their fight had accomplished nothing strategically. And they had lived under communist rule for 45 years, governed by the power whose betrayal had doomed their uprising. The German perpetrators of atrocities in Warsaw faced limited accountability. Some officers, including Heinz Reinefeld, who commanded forces during the Wola massacre, escaped serious punishment. Reinefeld became a mayor in West Germany after the war, living comfortably until his death in 1979. The disparity between the suffering inflicted and the accountability demanded haunted survivors and families of victims. The tactical lessons from Warsaw influenced post-war thinking about urban warfare and insurgency. The uprising demonstrated that insurgents, however brave and numerous, cannot hold urban terrain against regular forces equipped with artillery, armor, and air support without external support. The lessons was validated in subsequent uprisings from the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 to various urban battles in modern conflicts. The political lesson that great powers will sacrifice small nations to their strategic interests, regardless of promises or moral obligations, was clear but seldom acknowledged openly. Poland was strategically located between Germany and Russia, valuable to both, controlled by neither by choice. The Warsaw Uprising demonstrated what happens when a small nation attempts to assert independence against the will of a neighboring great powers. The specific character of the fighting in Warsaw, the close quarters urban combat conducted in rubble, the use of sewers for movement, the improvised weapons and tactics, all became studied examples of urban resistance. Military planners examining the challenges of urban operations study Warsaw as a case where defenders utilized terrain and determination to inflict heavy casualties on attackers despite massive material disadvantage. The role of civilians in the Warsaw Uprising, both as victims and participants, complicates simple narratives. Civilians supported the uprising by providing shelter, food, and intelligence. They served as medics, couriers, and logistics personnel. But they also died in numbers far exceeding military casualties, often deliberately targeted by German forces conducting collective punishment. This raises ethical questions about armed resistance in densely populated urban areas. Does the moral legitimacy of resistance justify exposing civilian populations to predictable reprisals? The Home Army leadership argued that Poles had a right and duty to resist occupation. Critics countered that launching an uprising that would inevitably result in massive civilian casualties without realistic prospect of success was morally indefensible. These questions have no definitive answers. They involve judgments about moral obligations, strategic calculation, and the value placed on resistance versus survival. Different people examining the same facts reach different conclusions. What is clear is that 200,000 civilians died in an uprising that accomplished none of its strategic objectives. The comparison to other uprisings of World War II was instructive. The Slovak National Uprising, launched in August 1944, also failed but resulted in far fewer civilian casualties because it was conducted primarily in rural areas. The Prague Uprising of May 1945 succeeded because it occurred as Allied forces were actually entering the city. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, while also ending in defeat, had different context and objectives. Warsaw in 1944 was unique in its combination of scale, urban setting, duration, and the political context of Soviet betrayal. No other uprising in occupied Europe involved comparable numbers of fighters, comparable civilian casualties, or comparable destruction of a major European capital. The 63 days of the Warsaw Uprising were 63 days of suffering that changed nothing strategically. Poland remained occupied, first by Germans, then by Soviets. The London government was not restored. Polish independence was not achieved. The Home Army was destroyed. The city razed. 200,000 civilians were killed. And when Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they established the communist government that would rule Poland for the next 45 years. Yet, to say the uprising changed nothing may miss what it did accomplish in the realm of human spirit and moral witness. The Poles fought because they believed freedom was worth fighting for. They fought knowing the odds, understanding the costs, choosing defiance over submission. That choice did not achieve strategic objectives, did not prevent communist rule, did not save the city, but it demonstrated that there are things worth fighting for even when victory is impossible. This is the Warsaw Uprising. 63 days of brutal urban combat, 200,000 dead, a city destroyed, and strategic objectives unachieved. It was courage wasted through tragic timing, determination undone by political betrayal, and sacrifice that bought nothing except the knowledge that Poles would fight for freedom, even when fighting was futile. The uprising changed nothing strategically, but everything morally. A demonstration that human dignity demands resistance, even when resistance is doomed. Warsaw rose, fought, and was destroyed. May we remember both the courage and the tragedy, honor the dead, and learn from their sacrifice.